What's shaking booktube? My name's Cam and welcome back to another video. You know who one of my favourite fictional characters of all time is? Kinnicky. If it wasn't already obvious, today I'm doing a spoiler-free review for S.E. Hinton's The Outsiders. The Outsiders is considered a literary classic. It's required reading for a lot of classrooms. And the reason for this is that it's described as having strong themes of overcoming prejudice both externally and internally. What I mean by that is overcoming prejudice you have for other people and overcoming prejudice that you hold against yourself in regards to the groups you're with or the expectations that you think people have for you. I want to make it clear really quickly that I haven't seen the movie and I made a point of not watching the movie. As much as I really want to, especially after reading the book, and I'm sure I will watch it now, but right up to the point of doing the actual review, I wanted to make sure that my whole opinion of the story of The Outsiders is based entirely off of the book. An interesting factoid that I'm sure most people already know is that S.E. Hinton was actually 16 or 17. Some people say 16, some say 17. She was young when she wrote this, which is obviously an incredible accomplishment, especially back in the 60s. For a young woman of that age to publish a book, especially a book that has been described as being the first young adult book, it's pretty amazing. In regards to the finished product, I'm not sure how much might have been changed during the publication process or polished. I mean, like I said, it's very impressive that she wrote this book at that age. I'm just saying, I'm not sure how much of it in the end was entirely her, but that's the case with pretty much every published book, so it's not a big deal. The thing is, in reviewing the book The Outsiders, I'm not going to be taking into consideration how young she was at the time, because although it is impressive, my review of the book is a review of just the book as it is. If I start taking into consideration things like, or variables, like how experienced or inexperienced the author is every time I review a book, it becomes a whole other thing. So the story focuses around Ponyboy. You heard me right? Ponyboy. Ponyboy Curtis. It says that on my birth certificate. Who was a young member of a supposedly violent gang, the Greasers. The gang, the Greasers, are in class or social class warfare with the Socias, who are the social kids, the rich kids. In this day and age, most people would probably recognize those groups as the Greasers and the Preppies. Through the course of the story, a number of severe incidents take place, and Ponyboy learns that maybe the Socias aren't too different to them, and maybe the expectations he has within his own gang, or the expectations he thinks people have from him, aren't all it seems to be. That's the general gist of The Outsiders. And you know, it's kind of funny because reading this story in like this day and age, it's kind of weird to think of Greasers as anything less than like a really glamorous and cool lifestyle. And I think we have media like Grease and the Fonz to thank us for that. Everything's convinced us that Greasers were really cool. And I can get down with that. I mean, look how I fill out a pair of jeans. Ooh. Ah. But look, if we're being completely honest with ourselves, the Greasers really don't seem like the kind of people that you actually want to be around. And it's something I've always wondered as well. Another parallel could be like rock stars. Rock stars today as well, of course, but primarily I'm referring to like rock stars from the 70s to the 80s. We look back on it as such a glamorous and cool thing, you know, trashing the hotel rooms and just being reckless and rebelling. That was the idea. That's what's sold to us as rock and roll. And it ends up being a lot less about the actual music and more so just being a dick. Like if you've watched the movie The Dirt, based on Motley Crue, which is like one of my favorite bands of all time as far as music goes, but they aren't the kind of dudes you would want to hang out with. Like, they're assholes. I am glad that I finally know the context behind the phrase "Stay Gold, Ponyboy," because all I had to go off until now was that scene from Step Brothers.
Stay golden, Ponyboy. I gotta pee.
I have a lot of views on this book, a lot of views, and there are a lot of pros, don't get me wrong, but I don't think it's the masterpiece that people sell it to be. But bear with me, here's why. The first and biggest one I'm going to get out of the way straight away is just that I really don't believe there's anything all that profound about the story of The Outsiders. I'm pretty damn confident that if the exact same book was written today, it would get called out on this immediately. I know it was written in a different time, I get that, and I am willing to take allowances for that, but I stand by the fact that I just don't think it's as deep or insightful as a lot of self-proclaimed intellects like to say it is. I mean, what's funny to me is that you'll have people who trash the YA of today, and there is a lot of garbage YA today, of course. But they'll trash it as being vapid, and then refer to The Outsiders as being one of the pinnacles of literary fiction when it comes to YA. But here's the thing, we know that the major theme of the story is overcoming prejudice. That's the first thing most people say when they're talking about the themes of The Outsiders. But why do we know that? Why do we know that it's about overcoming prejudice? Or how do we know that? Is Ponyboy exposed to his own prejudices that he has firsthand? Does he witness or experience something that specifically focuses on prejudices or the consequences of having prejudice? No, absolutely not. We only know that because the female love interest, but not love interest, literally tells him that straight up almost at the very start of the story. And almost immediately after those two characters meet. I'll bet you think the Socias have it made. The rich kids, the West Side Socias. I'll tell you something, Ponyboy, and it may come as a surprise. We have troubles you've never even heard of. You want to know something? She looked me straight in the eye. Things are rough all over. And Ponyboy's just like, oh, okay. Later on in the story, there's a completely inconsequential interaction with a Soc who has also identified the folly of their rivalry, and it's kind of a really pointless interaction because by that point, Ponyboy has well and truly already come to terms with the fact that the Socias and the Greases are quite similar. Not that we ever see any reason to actually believe that, we're just told that. That quote I just mentioned about the Socias having troubles, I still don't fucking know what those troubles are. I have no idea how the Socias and the Greases are actually both troubled groups. Or the closest thing we have to an explanation is that the Socias are so cold that they don't feel anything, and it's like, okay, but like, what's the source of that? There's no exploration into that at all. The thing is, if the main theme of the book is meant to be, or it's sold as being, Ponyboy coming to terms with the fact that he has to accept that they're not so different from their rival group, there has to be a bit of conflict there. That's a realization he has to come to after an event, but that's not the case. There are events in the story, major events, but really think about those events. They don't actually have anything to do with comparing the two gangs against each other and showing that they're both troubled groups. They're just things that happen. There's no conflict in Ponyboy accepting that the Socias aren't as bad as they seem. He just kind of goes, fair enough. It seemed funny to me that the sunset she saw from her patio and the one I saw from the back steps was the same one. Maybe the two different worlds we lived in weren't so different. We saw the same sunset. Now that's what I call deep. I don't mean to just talk shit. I think a good example I can give you of a movie that does what I think The Outsiders was trying to do is American History X. Obviously, American History X deals with a lot more extreme examples of these themes, replacing the juxtaposition of social classes with actual racial warfare. That's obviously, I won't say a whole different thing, because like I said, the themes are still the same, overcoming prejudice, and it's told from a young person that has been sucked into that gang or that lifestyle. And the story is still about learning that people aren't so different from you, but American History X does a much better job of that. I won't go into that too much. That's a whole separate video essay that's been done by plenty of other people. That's really the biggest issue I have with The Outsiders, so if it sounds like I hate the book, I don't. It's just, that was the biggest thing. I don't think it's as profound as people like to remember it. I think a lot of the love that this book gets is riding on the back of nostalgia. I think a lot of people read this in high school and they refuse to accept that maybe it's not as insightful as they think it was. Another thing that irritated me a little bit about The Outsiders, and I'm not sure if this is just my ignorance to that whole decade, like I said, all of the exposure I've had to like the 60s and Greases, all that kind of stuff has come from media, mostly like films and stuff, and obviously that is more often than not exaggerated, so I don't know. But the gang, the Greases, isn't exactly what I would expect from a violent, underprivileged gang in 60s Oklahoma. Like, did Greases back then call each other honey and baby? Is that a thing? So the biggest themes in The Outsiders was, overcoming prejudice externally, so the idea of prejudice for the Socias, even though they're not so different. And there was also meant to be a bit of a struggle with Ponyboy accepting that the tough exterior expectation from the gang that he's in isn't all it seems to be and isn't really reflective of reality, really. But to be honest, I never really saw that that was much of a struggle for him at all. I don't think that was a big conflict. I mean, Ponyboy feels, at least to me, feels pretty inauthentic for the context of the story. He's a smart kid, he's kind, he's compassionate, he wants to do well in school, so he does well in school. So he's quite intelligent, he's emotional, he cites poetry, he talks about how much he loves sunsets to a girl that he just met. And all of this stuff, it's not a problem per se, it's not issues. I am fine with the idea of there being this sensitive kid in a tough gang, but there obviously has to be a purpose to that. I was under the impression that these would be things that held him back or got him into shit with his tough gang, him being so emotional or into all this stuff that they would probably see as being, well, I'm not going to use the word they would use in 60s Oklahoma, but you know what I mean. But the thing is, the rest of the gang, even like the tough ones that are meant to be hardened criminals, they're all pretty damn supportive of this stuff. No one seems to give a shit. I struggle to remember, like, any point in the story where Ponyboy is pressured into doing stuff that he doesn't want to do for the sake of looking tough. It's just, if anything, they push him away from that stuff. Like I said, I'm okay with providing a contrast between a tough gang and being a different type of person on the inside of that gang, but it needs to be for a reason. There should be a struggle or some kind of conflict there, but there just wasn't. It really came to no kind of climax, so it's hard for me to imagine that there was any real lesson in that. In fact, quite a few times I came close to forgetting that this gang were even meant to be like the tough guys or like the bad apples of society or anything like that. I almost completely forgot at a lot of points that they were, or at least they expected from themselves, that they were the outcasts, that they were the outsiders. The only times you were reminded of this is when you were straight up told this, more often than not through the characters 2-Bit and Dally. I'm just gonna be straight up, I feel like some of these characters, especially Ponyboy, were kind of written as wish fulfillment. This ties into what I was saying before, where if this was written nowadays, I feel like people would pick up on this. And I mean, we have a protagonist who is a bad boy, but is continuously clarified as being quite attractive. We get a lot of clarification how muscular these boys are from the perspective of Ponyboy. I think we must have been told like 50 times how attractive Soda Pop is. But Ponyboy's a bad boy who is a good fighter, but he's also really smart. He's troubled and brooding, but he's also emotional and deep and like sunsets. It felt a bit like someone's idea of a perfect boy. That's all I'm saying on that. I suppose a point of contention for a lot of people was that The Outsiders lacked a lot of descriptive writing or prose, but honestly, it didn't bother me too much, so that's not a big deal, really. The last thing I would want to mention as, I guess, a con or an irritation is a hard one to mention without spoiling, but let me just say that anyone who's read the book's gonna know what I mean, but the event that results in the major life-changing thing for Ponyboy, the thing that leads to the big emotional moment, that whole situation had almost no emotional impact on me whatsoever. And I'm a pretty emotional guy when I'm reading stuff. I've been known to shed a few tears just as much with a book as I do in the shower. The whole emotional part of this book, though, which I know is the major thing that most people remember the book for, I just didn't feel it. And I think the reason for that is that the big event that led to that emotional thing happening was so completely random. Like, what the hell? It kind of, like, the event had almost nothing to do with the rest of the story. Like, the event kind of happened out of nowhere and did not happen as a result of anything else that had happened in the story. So for me, it just felt kind of cheap. It kind of felt like it was written in there almost entirely just so that it could use tragedy as the nail to drive the points home, which in any other book would be called out as being a really lazy tactic.
Hey, Cam from the future here. I just want to draw your attention to something really quick. I'm going to replay a little bit just then, and this is unrelated to the review, but just listen to this, alright?
Which in any other book would be called out as being a really lazy tactic.
Did you hear that noise, like in the background of me talking? I'll play it again.
Which in any other book would be called out as being a really lazy tactic.
I'm just editing the video and I'm kind of wondering to myself, what the fuck is that?
Despite all of what I've just said, I don't actually hate The Outsiders book. I don't think I'd even go so far as to say I dislike it. I just think that there is a very different opinion of the book out there in the majority to what my experience was, and that kind of surprised me and, well, disappointed me a lot because I'm a big fan of the whole 60s culture. I love reading stories set in that time, but that's part of the problem here. I think if you eliminated the fact that the gang we're reading about are greasers, I think people would have a lot of different feelings about this book. I think it rides a lot on the back of it being a cool, glamorous group. Here's the thing, I'm fine with this being required reading. I'm completely cool with that. That's cool. I think that young people especially, maybe even a bit younger than young adult, I think they could definitely find some value in this. All I'm saying is that there may not have been a lot of better alternatives back then from the 60s to, I don't know, like the 90s or late 80s or whatever, but I know nowadays there are books, both modern and classic, that discuss and explore the themes of prejudice and overcoming prejudice just a lot better. But like I said, if there's any valuable or positive themes to be taken away from this book, which I think there are, they're just quite surface level, then absolutely, have your kids read it. Sure. It's especially impressive because of the age it was written at by S.E. Hinton, and because it was, from what I'm told, the story that pioneered the YA genre as it is. I think that's something that should always be credited and appreciated. So something I really did enjoy about The Outsiders is that character flaws were treated as exactly that, character flaws. Especially when it came to characters like Johnny or Dally. It felt like the issues that made them the personalities that they were discussed as exactly what they were, and it's a bit hard to give you an example of that, but I guess what I mean is that with a lot of books you read, especially in the YA genre, it feels like when a character is written with flaws, as all characters should be, it's approached usually in one of two ways, and it's either unapologetic, where it feels like the writer doesn't even feel that these obvious flaws are in fact flaws, and it's written as if these are things that strengthen them or should be promoted. But then on the polar opposite side of that, you have these flaws written by a writer as if they hate the idea that they've written this character in this way so much that it has a kind of toxic cloud that just infects the rest of the story and makes it hard to believe that the author actually enjoyed writing this story whatsoever or believes in the content that they've created. As for The Outsiders, the flaws are written pretty genuinely. I also really enjoyed the dynamic between the brothers Ponyboy and his oldest brother, Dari, who is basically the guardian for him, and the middle brother, Soda Pop. Yeah, I know the names are like... yeah, okay. In fact, I kind of find myself wishing that the relationship between Ponyboy and Dari was the main focus for the entire story, because that's what interested me the most. You have this older brother who, under different circumstances, probably would have been a Soch, but because of the death of their parents, and because he now has to care for and raise his two younger brothers, it's put them in a situation both financially and socially where they found themselves inexplicably falling into a lesser group, the Greasers. That's the closest it came to actually exploring the themes that you've been told this book is focusing on, but that wasn't really, delved into as much as I would have liked. But when it was there, it was still really, really enjoyable, and still, that's probably the only part of the story where I actually got a bit of an emotional jab, is the interaction towards the end between those two brothers, Ponyboy and Dari. That did make me feel quite emotional. All in all, I hope it doesn't feel like this video has just been a complete trash talk of The Outsiders, because I don't think it's a bad book. All I'm saying is that I just don't think it was that profound or remarkable. That's it. I'm almost certain that if it was written today, and if it was written about a gang that, the media hasn't sold to us as being a really glamorous and cool thing, I just don't think this story would have gotten as much interest as it did. I will say that it was a young adult that felt like a young adult. An issue I have for a whole other video is that a lot of protagonists in YA nowadays, they're not even young adults. They're written as being the age of a young adult, but really it's just self-insert fiction for the author in most cases. The protagonist isn't a young adult, it's just an adult who is written to be at a young adult's age. All of their personality and opinions and experiences could be seamlessly transferred into an adult character, and it would make no difference. And I think that kind of renders the whole idea of it being a YA completely useless. I mean, fantasy gets a bit more leeway, obviously, but more contemporary stories with heavy themes, I think, should really feel like they're being told about or by a young adult. Anyway, The Outsiders gets let's say 2 stars. Hope you like this book review. It was a bit of a deep dive. I'm looking forward to watching the movie. I really am. I'm imagining this translated to the screen, and it seems like an enjoyable experience. I'm cool with that. As always, thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video. Catch ya.
She's got class and style, street knowledge by the pound, yeah. Baby never act wild, very low key on the profile. Catching feelings is an art. Let me show you how it goes. Loves the world, spins the vibe.